Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with our 9th session. My name is Aaron Brown. I'm here as a representative from the University of Tampa. I think as we have covered in numerous presentations so far, and as many of us know from personal experience, the challenges facing our estuaries don't just end at the water's edge. Within our watersheds, from the most upper reaches right down to our riparian and intertidal zones, those conditions have a drastic impact on the health and functions of our aquatic systems.
Hello, and thanks to the organizers of the Basis 7 meeting for inviting us. We appreciate the opportunity to meet with this group. Today, Emily, Klipp, and I will discuss the NOAA Dewberry recent topobathymetric Lidar surveys of Tampa Bay. So in terms of what to expect, I'll introduce the Dewberry topobathymetric team and capabilities and give a 35,000-foot overview of topobathymetric LiDAR. And then Emily will provide some detail on the NOAA Dewberry 2020-2021 topobathymetric LiDAR projects in northern and southern Tampa Bay. Just in case you don't know Dewberry, we are a national firm of planning, design, and construction professionals. We create responsible and innovative solutions for those who own, operate, and maintain natural and built environments. We value lasting relationships, achieving our clients' visions, and celebrating in their success. As you can see on the map, Dewberry has a sizable presence in the Tampa Bay area, with offices in Tampa, Lakeland, and Sarasota. We are also a prime contractor for the USGS on the GYPSY 4 contract and for NOAA on the OCS and CGSC 4 contracts. Here's our topobathymetric team. Martin Iagandi, our Geospatial Technology and Services Senior Vice President, and note that he was also the principal author on the 2007 Tampa Bay Bathymetric Survey and map from the USGS, along with Emily Klipp, Andrew Erickson, Keith Patterson, our Florida licensed PSM, and myself. By now, most people are generally familiar with how terrestrial LiDAR works, but topobathymetric LiDAR, commonly called topobathy, is really a different animal. So I'd like to provide you a 35,000-foot overview of how topobathy LiDAR works. At this 35,000-foot level, we identify three basic differences between topographic and topobathy LiDAR. First, the scan pattern and look angles. Terrestrial LiDAR is generally taken nadir with a zigzag ground pattern to make a swath, an area that's covered by the LiDAR. But topobathy is forward-looking, generally around 23 degrees, and has a circular scan pattern that defines a swath diameter. Secondly, topographic LiDAR just travels through air, albeit different temperatures and maybe densities, but topobathy travels through two different density media, necessitating correction for each and every pulse for refraction through the water by application of Snell's law. And thirdly, the energy from the laser is about 10 times greater. The light is in the visible green range, around 532 nanometers, versus infrared at 1064 nanometers. And the sensor requires multiple receiving channels to capture the surface, shallow water, and deep water returns. The return energy is also highly dependent on the water turbidity, KD, the bottom reflectivity, the albedo, and the surface motion. Bubbles and flat water are really troublesome. So with that 35,000-foot overview, here's a quick picture of the Dewberry Coastal Zone mapping in imaging LiDAR supernova sensor. Sometimes we call it a SEASMIL, and some of its capabilities. I want you to note that the sensor can see through 3.5 Secchi disks worth of water and through a high KD capability. Also of note is the 7 shallow channels and the 1 deep channel that the sensor has. Dewberry maintains the seasonal supernova sensor at the Peter O. Knight Airport, just a little bit north of here on Davis Island, Tampa. So please feel free to stop by, better call first, and visit us. And with that as an introduction, I'm going to turn this over to Emily, our project manager on the NOAA Tampa Bay Topobathymetric surveys and shoreline mapping projects.
Thanks, Al. I'm a project manager and have been with Dewberry for over 7 years now. However, I've been working with Topobathy Lidar for almost 15 years. Today, I'm excited to share some information on 2 recent NOAA projects from right in our own backyard, Tampa Bay. One of which is complete and the other is very close to it. We work closely with NOAA's National Geodetic Survey Remote Sensing Division Coastal Mapping Program, which requires the collection of airborne topobathy LiDAR and aerial imagery data to enable accurate and consistent measurement of the national shoreline. As I mentioned, 2 of our most recent projects for this program encompass Tampa Bay, the first covering the northern portion of the bay to include Old Tampa Bay. These data were acquired with a Regal VQ880G2 in November and December of 2019. This project is complete and has been accepted by NOAA and should be available on the digital coast soon. The data for the second project, covering middle and lower Tampa Bay, were acquired with our seasonal NOVA system in January and February of 2021. The LiDAR for this project was just accepted by NOAA, and the shoreline compilation is in progress and set to be delivered by the end of March for NOAA's review. In the northern Tampa Bay project, while we didn't anticipate full coverage across the bay due to depth and turbidity of the area, we did get great coverage along the shoreline and near shore areas and were able to achieve returns down to -7 meters NAV-D88. Here you can see the topographic surface displayed in orange and bathymetric surface in green. The nearshore bathymetry can be the toughest area to collect using traditional boat-based surveys, and airborne topobathy LiDAR is a safe and reliable approach that has numerous applications in the coastal zone, including navigation and inundation modeling. These data provide a seamless topobathymetric data product ideal for various applications within the entire coastal community. Today, I'll talk about how these data will be used by NOAA NGS to enable accurate and consistent measurement of the national shoreline. While a primary method of how the national shoreline has been produced is using traditional stereophotogrammetry compilation from tide-coordinated aerial imagery, in recent years, NGS has developed a state-of-the-art approach based on airborne topobathymetric LiDAR data and tidal datum extraction methods. So the first steps for creating and updating the national shoreline are to acquire and process imagery and LiDAR. The next step is to compile the continuously updated shoreline product known as the CUSP, which is the mean high water line produced from the LiDAR. Next, features are compiled from the ortho imagery. Some of the features included are aids to navigation, freestanding marine structures, alongshore features, danger area, aquatic vegetation areas, just to name a few. This is known as the interim geographic cell shoreline. Lastly, the attribution of those features are finalized and more explicitly defined. For instance, the alongshore features get further divided into 24 more refined classifications, such as bridges, piers, breakwaters, groins, and jetties. This fully attributed product is known as the final geographic cell shoreline. NOAA utilizes the information from this final GC shoreline to update and create their nautical charts. Our most recently completed NOAA acquisition encompassed middle and lower Tampa Bay to include the Manatee River, as shown here with the red boundary. In this project, we achieved even more coverage than in the north, perhaps due to potentially better water conditions and more reflective bottom substrate, but also because of the sensor that was used. We used our seasonal NOVA sensor, which is a waveform resolving system that has separate shallow and deep water channels. This LiDAR can penetrate the water column down to about 3.5 Secchi disk depths, where other traditional topobathy LiDAR systems only go to about 1.5 or 2 Secchi disk depths. You can see here in green that the bathy coverage extends past the project boundary and into the deeper water in the center portion of the bay. In this AOI, we were able to achieve returns down to -9 meters NAV-D88. This is an example from the Pinellas Point area here in St. Pete. On the left is an example of the orthoimagery that we collect for these projects, and on the right is the Topobathymetric Lidar digital elevation model. So this is just a great example of the full coverage we were able to achieve in most of the AOI. Seamless coverage from land to bathymetry, as well as across the bathymetry of this entire portion of the AOI. One lesson learned during this project was that even with a water quality sonde system with a built-in rotating wiper, a full ecosystem can take it down in just 3 weeks. The system consisted of a data buoy with a cellular data logger and a YSI water quality sonde that simultaneously measures and logs temperature, conductivity, and turbidity. The system also contains a central wiper meant to extend the deployment and reduce maintenance. However, towards the end of our acquisition and after about 2.5 weeks of deployment in the bay, we had a small storm come through. We expect to see this cause a rise in turbidity values with a fairly quick drop within a day or two. This time, the turbidity measurements began to steadily increase, which contradicted our visual observations, so we decided to go out in the field and check out what was going on. As suspected, when we pulled it out of the water, we realized the automated wiper had at some point stopped working and a newly formed marine ecosystem was growing on the sonde. So at this time, we determined our visual observations of water quality combined with the data returns we were receiving was acceptable information to complete the last few lines in our acquisition. And to summarize where the data availability for these projects are. So as I mentioned, all of the data for the northern project has been accepted by NOAA and should be published on NOAA's Digital Coast soon. And the data for the second project, the LIDAR and the orthoimagery and DIMS have all been accepted, and we're wrapping up the Shoreline files now, and those should be accepted by the end of the month. And once they're fully accepted, the project will also be available on the Digital Coast probably in a few months from now. I did want to talk about one deliverable that I haven't shown here, but could be useful in particular in the southern Tampa Bay project, which is seabed reflectance rasters that have a correction performed to raw intensity values from the bathy LIDAR returns that account for attenuation due to depth and angle of incidence. The normalized bathymetric return intensities will provide the baselines for generating benthic habitat maps in study areas without the need for rigorous radiometric calibration. The benthic habitat maps will support analysis of seagrass availability and potentially provide spatially continuous baseline data for monitoring nearshore aquatic habitats. Something we are consistently asked about is how we assure and measure the accuracy of the Topobathymetric LIDAR and derived products. So we've published a story map to guide people through this process. The link can be found here. And last but not least, I am happy to say that we were just awarded a new project from NOAA NGS and are currently acquiring LIDAR data and imagery along the east coast of Florida over the Indian River Lagoon, from Ponce Inlet in the north down to Fort Pierce. We expect a complete acquisition sometime in April, and I look forward to being able to provide these data to NOAA and the coastal community. We would like to acknowledge all of the folks at NOAA NGS for entrusting us to acquire and process these data for their coastal mapping program. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time with questions or comments. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Kristin Miller from the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program with watershed planning, setting the stage for restoration in coastal Alabama.
All right, thanks. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here today. Just kind of want to talk to you all a little bit about some of the work we've been doing over the course of the last decade at the NEP in Mobile. Go ahead, next slide for me. So just real briefly, for those of y'all who are not familiar with the watershed, it's quite large, fourth largest drainage basin in terms of flow volume in the United States. We focus primarily in Mobile and Baldwin counties, but obviously trying to get the good word up the watershed as much as possible too. Next slide for me. And then locally, we are set up as a division of the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, founded in '95 and kind of been working towards providing services to Mobile and Baldwin County pretty much ever since that point. Next slide for me. And the way we've done this obviously is through implementation of our CCMP. Going back to the previous iteration, which got going in 2013, we started undertaking this watershed-based approach and have kind of had 10 years under our belt now and kind of have a proof of concept of that, which I'll talk a little bit more as we go along. But this is kind of how we're structured here in Mobile Bay. So basically, through our management conference, everything gets funneled through that science advisory committee and then up to the executive committee. So all those different sectors of our community working together to help implement this CCMP, which is kind of based on this watershed planning approach. Next slide for me. So going kind of back to how we got started, obviously we've got I think about 95 or so HUC 12 watersheds in Mobile and Baldwin County, and we obviously can't do all those, at least not right away. So we had to undertake a prioritization effort. We did this through our project implementation committee, which is made up of all of our resource manager, kind of shovel in the ground folks. So going through, you know, what kind of data do we have available, and trying to look at all these watersheds and kind of settled on looking mainly at intertidal watersheds. So that kind of whittled those 95 down to half. So we've got about 42 HUC 12 watersheds in Mobile and Baldwin County that are tidally influenced. Next, okay. So over the course of the last 10 or so years, we've made a lot of headway in getting watershed plans developed and in implementation across Mobile and Baldwin County. And this is kind of our current state here. You'll just kind of see these are all color coded. So the ones that are complete are in green, and then the blue ones are still in progress, and we have one more left to do. When I first came on board back in 2009, we were just getting underway with the doe leaf plan, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and then you can hear a lot more from Jason Cadulas from our staff tomorrow. And at that point, we were having to whittle these different pots of money together. It cost about 250-ish in that neighborhood, $1,000 for one watershed for one HUC 12. And then we start seeing some economies of scale as we start adding more of those together. So you can see on this map, some of them are grouped. That yellow outline, so like right in the middle of the Tensile Delta, that grouped 6 HUC 12 watersheds together. So instead of $250,000 each, we're able to get all these done for about $500,000. So that's provided a good economy, although if you talk to some of our contractor folks, they'll tell you that not so much, but we'll leave that for later discussion. Next slide. So through this process, working through the PIC, we just kind of went to them, presented all this data, and then just kind of asked them, so on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest priority, just kind of ranked. So we went through all of the intertidal watersheds, and you can kind of see what they came back with. So this was just kind of a way to help prioritize, so we know, how best we can start knocking these off. And obviously, as we've gone through this process over the course of the last 10 years or so, different priorities have come up and forced us to kind of move these together, or it made sense to add a couple more to it. We got past, obviously, the scrambling to put pots of money together, and then we're able to bring some of the BP related funding on board to start getting the rest of these going. If you want to go to the next for me. So as part of that last CCMP effort, we went out in the community and wanted to find out what they value most about coastal Alabama. So what we heard back from them, basically we were able to categorize into these 6 broad areas that we call our values. Basically, everything kind of can be pigeonholed into one of these 6 areas. So that access, coastlines, fish and wildlife, heritage and culture, resilience, and then water quality. So next slide for me. We went out to our science advisory committee and asked them to go through a process of looking at all of our coastal habitats, the ecosystem services they provide, and the ones that are under most stress from anthropogenic change. And what they came back to us with are, these are our top 3 habitats most impacted by human action. So freshwater wetlands, intertidal marshes and flats, and then streams, rivers, and riparian buffers. You can go to the next one for me. So why am I telling you all that? So obviously EPA has their own criteria for watershed planning. So all of our watershed plans meet those EPA 9 key elements, but then on top of that, we have to answer to those 6 values, because that's what we heard from the community, why they are, or what's their hook? Why do they care about watershed planning in coastal Alabama? So we meet in those 9 key elements. We're meeting or answering the 6 values, and we're trying to address those critical habitats that have been identified through our SAC. So in that watershed planning process. And if you want to hit the next and one more time. So these are basically just went through a long process of habitat mapping and prioritizing areas for restoration and conservation. And all these different projects that have been going on are feeding into our watershed plans and helping to inform the watershed plans that are going on simultaneously. So looking for ways where we can group projects that have been prioritized, be that for size or proximity to developed areas. Baldwin County, for those of y'all who are not familiar with that area, reminds me a lot of what this place used to look like about 30 years ago. My grandparents lived down here. I grew up fishing on the Peace River with my granddad. So I've seen what's happened in Florida, and that's coming to Alabama now. So trying to get out ahead of that and have a plan in place to conserve and protect those reasons that people are wanting to move down here to begin with. So that's kind of part and parcel of why I've been doing that. So we go to the next one for me. And this is obviously a new approach when you're sitting down with mayors and elected officials and municipal resource managers. They're used to working within city boundaries, and we're like, obviously water doesn't adhere to those boundaries. So trying to pull all these different people together that have disparate and sometimes conflicting interests to sit down and look at this new way or approach. So started in Doleave again, which is on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. Go one more time for me. So a rapidly urbanizing area on the eastern shore of Mobile Bay. Very high relief. We go from about 250 feet of elevation to sea level in just a matter of a couple miles. Very highly erodible soils, very intense rain showers. So as we develop, we have a recipe for a lot of erosion and sedimentation in that area. We go next to me. And this is a picture of Mobile Bay, and you can kind of see that one white plume coming out on the eastern shore there. That's a large residential area that was under development at the time. So this is just kind of something we've dealt with. Obviously, this plan got put in place in 2010, and we've been implementing that over the last 10 years. You'll hear more about this from Jason tomorrow, but just kind of to highlight, we've got a lot of investment now, about $15 million, about 12,000 linear feet of degraded stream, regulatory improvements, and go to the next one. And basically, the big take home here is we have been able to delist one of these stream segments now over the course of this 10-year process. So this has been kind of a game plan going forward, is adapting this Doleave planning effort as we've moved across these coastal watershed plans. Obviously, answering to those 6 key values, and then engagement. But these plans aren't done in a vacuum. Community engagement is a huge part of it, because these communities have to own the plan. They're going to be the ones left implementing once we have the plan in place. I mean, it's kind of up to them. And COVID has been a huge hindrance on this process for us. Next one. So these plans, I mean, they support community goals. I mean, we go through this process. It's about an 18-month process. At least it has been, probably more like 24 due to the pandemic. But we're educating the community through this process, listening to them. We rely on them extensively to help identify what the major issues, priorities are to highlight in these watershed plans. And then through this process, we're able to implement the recommendations that they have come up with. So this is everything from stream, riparian, buffer restorations. We've got a lot of shoreline related projects on the way right now. So just all sorts of stuff. Next one for me. I think one of the big take homes is working through the process with our elected officials, trying to institutionalize cooperation with all of our municipal and county folks. Alabama's kind of unique. We lack home rule, so anything outside of municipal boundaries makes it really hard when you're trying to look at stormwater management, because it has to go to Montgomery for approval and then be voted on by a statewide amendment. It's really, really very difficult. But we've been able to see a lot of regulatory issues addressed over the course of the last 10 years, a lot of improvement to pre and post-construction stormwater management. We've got a lot of communities now that not just allow for, but require low impact development and new construction. So a lot of improvement, and there's obviously a lot more improvement that needs to happen. And then obviously trying to engage the community through that process. And we do a lot of water quality monitoring through Alabama Water Watch and all of our local watersheds. Extensive work in the Mobile area, installing rain barrels, a lot of litter cleanups, paddle trips, signage, just any ways to get people involved and create some ownership through this process. So I think this is the big take home. We received funding through National Fish and Wildlife Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund, and then through Restore with a grant through the State's Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to fund the remaining intertidal watershed plans. This was done to key up projects for funding that we're coming back behind now and starting to see realized. So I mean, this is updated as of, I think, November of last year, but significant monies already allocated. These are from projects that were identified at least during the planning process. We don't wait for the plans to be completed. If we have a good project, we'll go ahead and start getting that implemented. So a lot more work that will be identified now going forward through these watershed plans, and then put into place. Need the next one from me. So this is just kind of a quick, dirty rundown of watershed planning. It's been a good way for us to engage our local community in Mobile and Baldwin counties and try to do a really good job of getting folks out and involved. Encourage y'all, if you have questions, my contact info is there, as well as we maintain a separate page on our website for all of our coastal watersheds that we're planning in and implementing in. Thank you.
All right, we do not have time for questions for Kristin right now, but please reach out and contact him with that information if you would like to engage. Our next presenter is Doug Robison from Environmental Science Associates, presenting comparative geospatial analysis of riparian vegetation changes in the Alafia and Little Manatee rivers. Go ahead, Doug.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see people in person. Next slide. First, want to say thanks to Tampa Bay Water and my client Bob McConnell, who couldn't be here today, but this project was funded by Tampa Bay Water as a special study under their hydrobiological monitoring program. And so this is a study of two rivers. I think a previous speaker this morning talked about 4 major rivers in Tampa Bay watershed: Hillsborough, Alafia, Little Manatee, and Manatee constitute about 85% of the freshwater inflow. These two in the middle here, the Alafia and the Little Manatee River, are the 2 of the 4 that are unimpounded and free flowing. So that makes them different from the other 2 in significant ways. These 2 rivers are pretty much comparable in terms of basin size, topography, soils, rainfall, and flows on a basin area basis. But they differ quite a bit in terms of their level of impact from anthropogenic activities. The Alafia River has been extensively mined. About 39% of the headwaters have been mined for phosphate. Phosphate is pulling out of that watershed, but large number of acres, thousands of acres of reclaimed lands. The watershed is quickly urbanizing in the eastern portion, or the western portion of the watershed in the Riverview area. And there's a major surface water withdrawal for drinking water by Tampa Bay Water. The Little Manatee River, in comparison, has some mining, but relatively much less. And there is a minor surface water withdrawal for power plant cooling water, but it's much less than the public water supply. Next slide. So the assumptions and purpose of this study is, the assumption is that sea level rise and climate change are going to drive changes in the vegetation communities, and they should be expressed relatively equally in these two watersheds. But the riparian vegetation communities may be differentially affected by these other anthropogenic stressors like mining and surface water withdrawals. So the purpose of this study was just to assess and quantify long-term changes in riparian vegetation communities, and that is intertidal and supratidal. We're not looking at seagrass. In these two river systems to gain some insight on the relative effects of sea level rise, climate change, and some of the other anthropogenic stressors. Next. So I mentioned the objectives here to map riparian vegetation in these two river systems from the mouth to the permanent freshwater zones over a period of about 1990 to 2021. There's two parts of this study I'll get to in a second here, but about a 30-year time period. Quantify the acreage losses and gains, net gains and losses, as well as gains and losses and conversions of native riparian vegetation, and those are classified as tidal wetlands, freshwater wetlands, and native uplands. Characterize and quantify species shifts and habitat conversions that may be indicative of sea level rise climate change, which is salt marsh to mangrove conversions, freshwater wetlands to tidal wetlands, and open water to mangrove. Next. So as mentioned, there's two parts to this. The first part was just taking the district land use layers. SwiftMud produces land use coverages roughly every 3 years. So we use 90, 99, 2011, and 2017 data sets from the district. And we use the flux code, a modified flux code that we use for the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's Habitat Master Plan, which categorize or bend hundreds of flux codes into 3 basic types: developed, restorable, and native habitats. Real quickly, restorable is soft development like golf courses, ag fields. Developed is urban landscapes that have been hardened. So that was the first part of it. We looked at those 4 time periods and just took the flux code, clipped it to the study area, and just looked at the numbers. The second part of this, we took Laban's high resolution aerial photography from 1999 and 2021, actually did a deep dive and did our own photo interpretation, created our own digital layer of the intertidal wetlands in these 2 study areas. So we did focus primarily on marshes because marshes are most sensitive to salinity changes and are going to react quickly to sea level rise. Next. So these 2 maps here show the study areas. On the top, it's Alafia, on the bottom, Little Manatee. The color coding is red is developed. Boy, I gotta use glasses to see that. I'm getting old, yeah, that's right. Restorable is in yellow, native uplands is dark green, tidal wetlands are light green, and freshwater wetlands are blue. So you can see the relative differences between development in the Alafia and Little Manatee. Alafia is quite a bit more developed in 2017. So the way we delineated these study areas, we took the USGS channel center line and we did a 1,000-foot buffer on either side. And that was the extent of it up to Bell Shoals Road in the Alafia and about 301 in Little Manatee. And if that buffer, or if that 1,000-foot offset crossed a contiguous wetland polygon, we included that entire wetland polygon. So this should represent all contiguous wetlands and uplands within that study area. Because of the difference in the geomorphology of these channels, the Alafia is quite a bit more in size. The study area, surface area is different. The Alafia is about 9,000 acres. Little Manatee is about 15,000, so about roughly twice as big as the Alafia. Next. So just the first part of the study, looking at just 1990 to 2017 land use changes, you can see that using our flux codes of tidal wetlands, freshwater wetlands, and native uplands, both watersheds experienced pretty big losses. You can see declining trends in all 3 types of native wetlands. Next slide, Ed. So the basic findings, the bullets from this part of the study is that there were significant losses in all native habitats in both study areas. The Alafia had a net loss of 49% of those native habitats, Little Manatee less so, but still a 29% loss. Largest habitat losses in both study areas were clearly due to urban development. Alafia had about a 39% increase in urban development. We thought it would be more than Little Manatee, but on a percentage basis, Little Manatee had a 58% gain in urban development. Habitat gains were much larger in the Manatee study area. Why would we have habitat gains? Well, there's different kinds of habitat gains. So we see changes from open water to vegetated areas or new intertidal wetlands. We also see changes in terms of conversions that look like open native uplands that are converted to freshwater marshes as a part of a creation of stormwater management areas in relation to development. You see in this photograph how an area that might be classified as uplands and then it gets refined as a stormwater pond shows up in the way the district classifies these areas as a freshwater wetland. Next slide. We look at the detailed deep dive and the marsh mangrove changes, and this is where I think it gets, the story gets really interesting. The blue line in these graphs are mangroves, green is freshwater marshes, and the red is salt marshes. You see salt marshes take a pretty big hit in both systems, and mangroves are clearly increasing. So this just quantifies that trend that we see anecdotally. Okay. In addition, we had some oligohaline marsh that we were able to map in the Little Manatee, and it also took a decline overall in terms of net acreage. Next slide. So we use the term tropicalization as kind of a paradigm of changes that we see with climate change and sea level rise. Climate change mostly with, not so much with rainfall, but with regard to the reduction of freeze events, severity and frequency. You know, I first moved down here in the 70s. We used to get freeze events and we'd see mangroves get wiped out in the northern part of Tampa Bay. And it would take, 5-10 years for them to recover. We just don't see much of that anymore. So where you have mangrove encroaching, they're pretty much going to be there for a while. They're not going to get knocked back like they used to be. What are some of the other effects of tropicalization? Well, the most significant indicative wetland conversion is salt marsh to mangrove, and then other to mangrove swamps, and other is maybe tidal flats or unvegetated shorelines that now have new mangrove growth on it. So on a percentage basis, the conversion of salt marsh to mangroves was comparable in both systems. And on an acreage basis, the mangrove expansion on tidal flats was also comparable in both systems. So we see kind of our assumption going in is that sea level rise climate change would exert those effects equally, and we see that in the data. We also see dynamic changes in oligohaline marshes in the Little Manatee. Next slide. So this is a GIS summary of wetland conversions. You don't spend too much time on the details, but the dark blue that you see in the Alafia here towards the mouth, that is conversion of salt marsh to mangrove. And you can see there's a point just about west of I-75 where that effect is, whatever salt marshes were there, they are changing, and they're probably not coming back anytime soon. Next slide. This one's a little more interesting. We've seen that same effect here in the Little Manatee. We have salt marsh conversion in mangrove, but look at east of I-75, that purple and green, that kind of mash of colors there. That's a very dynamic zone right now, and we're seeing loss of oligohaline marshes, gain of new oligohaline marshes, and loss of salt to mangrove. That little cluster of marsh, you're driving up 75 and you're looking off to your right, the east of I-75 and the Little Manatee, that's a very dynamic area right now. Whereas to the west of that, the salt marshes that were there have pretty much converted over to a mangrove system. Next. So the differential overall wetland gains and losses, the Alafia gained about 2%, or 9 acres or 2% in wetlands. Little Manatee lost 90 acres of wetlands. These are net changes. The most significant types of wetland gains include new mangrove growth on previously non-vegetated tidal flats, and freshwater marsh gains from construction of new stormwater ponds. The most significant type of wetland conversion was salt marsh to mangrove swamp, characterized by encroachment of mangroves into typically monotypic black rush marshes. And we've seen small overall increases of oligohaline marsh in the Little Manatee. Final slide. Riparian vegetation communities in the tidally influenced reaches of both of these rivers have undergone significant changes over the last 30 years. No question about that. Development's the biggest driver of change in the overall study area, but the effects of tropicalization, sea level rise, climate change are evident in both systems and pretty much equally experienced in both systems. But when you look at the effects of climate change and sea level rise compared to other stressors like withdrawals, mining, water quality, quantity impacts, I could show you much more data and get into the details here, but the overwhelming conclusion is sea level rise climate change is changing the drive or driving the changes in these systems far more than these other stressors. That's it. Thank you.
Doug, we got time for one question if, yeah.
You do have time for one question.
Yes, if anyone would like to ask a question of Doug. As far away as possible.
I guess overall, would you say that the current state and maybe the future state of just fragmentation of habitat is increasing, decreasing, or about the same?
In these two systems?
Yes.
Overall net gain or net loss, you're saying?
Well, just habitat fragmentation. So how?
Fragmentation.
Yeah.
More fragmented because of development.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Jennifer Shafer from Shafer Consulting, presenting the Community Playbook for Healthy Waterways, Strategic Planning for Holistic Community Action.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to take that mask off for a moment. Jennifer Shafer, president of Shafer Consulting, and I am one of the authors and architects of the playbook. I'd like to introduce my project partner, Dr. David Shafer, sitting in the front row over there, life partner as well. Aww. So this afternoon, I'd like to tell you what the playbook is, what's in it, and how we did it. Next slide. So I think you'll all agree, protecting water quality is something that protects our way of life. This is Sarasota Bay in the town where I'm from, just south of Tampa Bay. And led by the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program and its partners, our community has a decades-long commitment to improving water quality. With public and private investment, we've actually made historic gains in the Sarasota Bay Estuary. But with population growth, our water resources continue to be impacted. Unfortunately, long-term monitoring shows increasing nitrogen in Sarasota Bay. Data also show chlorophyll A exceeding regulatory thresholds and seagrass declining over the last few years in some bays. The Gulf Coast Community Foundation Board of Directors, located in Sarasota County, saw an opportunity to do more to catalyze coordinated action across the community. Next slide. So in response, the Gulf Coast commissioned the Community Playbook for Healthy Waterways. It's a stakeholder advised and researched collection of nutrient management activities for the whole community. It's meant to focus, prioritize, and coordinate community activity and philanthropy by engaging community leaders across government, nonprofits, philanthropic foundations, businesses, and homeowners associations. Next slide. So the playbook is organized around 3 goals: reduce, remove, sustain. First, to reduce anthropogenic nutrients by managing inputs from sources like fertilizer, biosolids, wastewater, septic systems, and engine emissions. Second, to remove active nitrogen from soil and water by locking it up long-term in plants and animals. Also by restoring and enhancing the action of bacteria in soil and water to process nitrogen with strategies like land conservation, species restoration, green infrastructure, and stormwater BMPs. And then third, to build capacity and resilience to sustain water quality improvements through education, incentives, partnerships, better data, and public policy. Next slide. So the playbook is available to the public as an online resource at waterqualityplaybook.org. This interactive graphic from the homepage shows the playbook's 10 topics from a watershed perspective, and it serves as visual navigation into the website. The strategies in the playbook were identified through facilitated brainstorming with local experts and practitioners, and further developed through research and expert interviews. The breadth and depth of the activities proposed by our expert committee left no stone unturned. Some are easy, some are hard, some cost a few thousand, many in the millions. So what's in the playbook? Next slide. The playbook features 43 specific community-wide activities across these 10 topics. Many nutrient management strategies focus on harnessing nature to help rebalance the nitrogen cycle. Other strategies require upgrading and implementing new and improved technologies. And cleaning up nutrient pollution also requires changing our behavior, adopting more sustainable practices with regard to fertilization and soil management. The playbook also recommends policy changes to help motivate and sustain improvements. Next. So to support first steps and to foster implementation of these activities, each activity in the playbook provides relevant and helpful information for the community to get started, including why it needs to be done, the context and the key players, and the status quo, the specific approach and key steps for implementation, as well as resources and experts to consult. And if you're looking for activities specific to your professional wheelhouse, the playbook activities are keyed to the 3 approaches of science, policy, or education. As an example, here is a screenshot of the first activity in the playbook to inventory wastewater facility treatment levels and capacities and prioritize upgrades. The sidebar icons and links allow easy navigation between related activities. Next. So let's take a closer look at the type of activity, type of localized detail that you'll find in these activities. Here again is activity 1.1 to inventory wastewater facility treatment level and capacity. So we obtained discharge monitoring data from Sarasota County's wastewater treatment facilities. In total, they generated more than 750,000 pounds of total nitrogen in 2018. We saw that one facility was generating more than twice the average load, and we calculated that conversion of this facility to advanced wastewater treatment would reduce annual total nitrogen by more than 80%, with a return on investment of $30 per pound of total nitrogen reduced. So that's actionable information that community leaders can use. And in fact, Sarasota Board of County Commissioners has pledged to upgrade all 3 of its plants, beginning with this one. Now, we don't claim credit for inspiring that action. There were a lot of conversations going on in the community, but we're on our way, at least with that activity. Next slide. So beyond what's in the playbook, we thought it might be helpful for this crowd to offer some details on how the playbook was put together, some lessons learned, and our community progress to date. It's sort of a playbook for creating the playbook, if you will. Next. So the catalyst for developing the playbook may have been the 2018 red tide outbreak along the Florida Gulf Coast. It was one of the most severe and prolonged in our area in recent memory, and the public was very concerned, to put it mildly. It made nutrients a household word, a dirty 9-letter word. The Gulf Coast Community Foundation, the board of directors, saw an opportunity to capture this moment to catalyze coordinated action across the community to improve water quality. The playbook would not be a cure for red tide, of course, as low-level red tide blooms occur along the Gulf Coast most years. But we did recognize the relationship that these excess anthropogenic nutrients may play in making our red tides more severe. And even if that did not prove the case, even if we had no impact on red tide, the worst thing that would happen was that we would have cleaner, healthier waterways. Next. So we began by inviting a very diverse group of individuals, hand-picked because of their expertise and because they were known by the community to be very community-minded and can-do kind of people. The Gulf Coast acted as the convener and offered a neutral meeting space and provided the singular common goal, which was solutions to remove and reduce nutrient pollution. No agendas, no pet projects, just laser focus on that goal. Any and every science-based solution was on the table, and we would get to the end through group consensus. This was not a one and done. We hosted multiple facilitated brainstorming sessions, alternating with check-in sessions to ensure that their ideas were tracking. And the process seemed very chaotic to some, as if we were never going to get through it. But with our clear vision of what the playbook would be, we made it, we got there. Next slide. So targeting. Early on, we were asked by the Gulf Coast Community Foundation Board of Directors, so who's going to be your target audience? They had assumed that it was going to be a tool to talk to residents about what they can do. But we took a different tack. We knew that in order to have the maximum impact, we needed to go directly to community decision makers themselves. So we made the possibly bold choice, probably not the choice that many people would have made, that we're going to specifically target decision makers with this playbook. So policymakers, not-for-profit CEOs, foundation heads, and homeowner association boards, who in fact sort of run their own little kingdoms and make their own policy for their private communities. And we have a lot of them in Sarasota. Next. We started our strategic communications early. We went to the agencies, not asking for permission to do the playbook, but rather asking them for their assistance to produce a document that would help them do their work, not to contradict it, not to supersede it. We contacted city and county administrators who had relevant departments, the Southwest Florida Water Management District, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the estuary programs. And we gave them early drafts and an opportunity to review some of the data and comment on some of our early findings. The goal was that by the time the playbook was published, the content would already be largely known. There'd be no surprises. Next. So where are we now? One of the biggest wins that we've had to date is that the Sarasota Board of County Commissioners have instructed the county administrator to use the playbook as an administrative directive to help track progress on all of the playbook activities relevant to the county departments. So twice a year, we convene all of the department heads and we go over the activities in the playbook and we get their updates. This has increased interdepartmental communication on all sorts of government matters affecting water quality, where they previously were siloed. Now they're talking to each other much more about interacting water quality concerns. Pulling together a list of data gaps has helped the community recognize and focus on filling those gaps. For example, tightening down the data set on where our septic systems are actually located and prioritizing those areas for conversion, conducting groundwater sampling to better understand nutrient loading, creating a reuse water irrigation map tool for homeowners and commercial fertilizer applicators to calibrate their fertilization rates if they're already applying reuse water. And with the community stakeholder playbook driven by the community, local foundations have made significant and confident investments in water quality improvement projects. So there's a lot more money flowing. This includes a major initiative to provide technical and grant support for HOAs to restore the health of their stormwater ponds. So with this playbook, we have a comprehensive, detailed, locally calibrated nutrient management strategy for implementation by leaders across the entire community. And we even hear that it's being used by our local delegation in Tallahassee. Next. So we credit the vision of John Thaxton, former Sarasota County Commissioner, now Gulf Coast Community Foundation Development Director, for bringing this talented group together. You can see our steering committee of experts here representing businesses, nonprofits, government agencies. Huge credit goes to our co-authors, David Shafer and Steve Swaw, and our able editor, Nanette O'Hara. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. We do have time for some questions.
Okay. Oh, that's right. I forgot. Yeah, everybody's online.
They don't know it's Chris.
Hey, Jennifer, this is really cool. I love the whole layout of the the playbook, and I'm glad to see that others are using it. But I mean, Sarasota Bay has a pretty well-established estuary program, and I was just wondering how this plan helps to kind of go along with the CCMP of the estuary program.
That's a great question, and I can answer that because I've, with my partner, written 4 of them. I swear I didn't plant that question. So yeah, as a matter of fact, we were developing the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program CCMP update almost parallel with developing the playbook. So there was a lot of coordination with staff, and we intentionally made sure that all of their goals and activities made it into the playbook, and for those that were relevant to water quality, vice versa. So how are they different? Why do we need 2? This one is laser focused on nutrient management, specifically nitrogen, whereas, as you know, the CCMPs cover many watershed management aspects. And it was a resource that was put together sort of grassroots, if you will, sponsored by a very well-respected community foundation, a well-respected leader. We tapped into networks that maybe we wouldn't have been able to working under the sort of agency partnership of the estuary program. So they're totally complementary. It's not meant to replace, only augment. And I think staff would agree that having more shoulders pushing on these goals has really helped.
Myself for just a minute. So this, I think more than a CCMP, it makes me think of the original Partnership for Progress document from the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium. And so I wonder if there are elements in there where folks are like pledging a letter of cooperation or a commitment to cooperate. Some of the things that I think about, like as a social scientist, in addition to being an environmental scientist, is that as the Nitrogen Management Consortium has moved into a regulatory framework, you know, we're producing a reasonable assurance plan and compliance assessments. And I wonder if we lose that element of cooperation, and how does the playbook maybe help facilitate that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I would say that the playbook has really created a forum for community conversation amongst stakeholders who might not otherwise have gotten together. They all sat around the table. They all just threw every idea out. We vetted them, we researched them. And I think that the benefit of the playbook has come from a broader community conversation. As I said, the major foundations in town see this as sort of their checklist. They see all kinds of projects that they can confidently fund, and they have started doing so. There's no requirement for anyone to pledge. It's totally voluntary, unlike a regulatory document. And so there's, I think, an appreciation that it's just a resource people can go to kind of sort of ground truth, double check. Is this what we should be doing? Is this what the community thinks? And it's been really helpful that way.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Next up, we have Tony Janicki from Janicki Environmental presenting a look back at long-term nitrogen loading trends in Tampa Bay.
Thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everybody. I forgot about the partner for yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It's funny because, you know, being here at the Hilton brings me full circle. For those that most of you will not remember, the initial NEP office was about 2 blocks down the street next to the Tavern on the Green, which was a very apropos place to have that meeting or have that office. But, you know, when I first started working on here in 1991, I could rent the penthouse here for $59 a night. And that's just because there were no people in St. Petersburg back then. So the growth has been pretty amazing. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today in particular. I also wanted to recognize my co-authors. As usual, they're the guys that did all the work, and I get to take all the praise for the great work that they've done. But in particular, you know, Hans Zarbock recently retired. He recently was working for Polk County, and David Wade is working for a pharmaceutical company, applying his statistical background in a very effective way. Ray Pribble still works with me, and again, I want to thank those guys for the great work that they've done. The other one is the Tampa Bay NEP Water Quality Subcommittee. And thankfully, I saw Roger Johansson walk in here at lunchtime because he's the only other one in this room that actually sat in on that Water Quality Subcommittee because they led much of the effort that we did, and we worked very closely with them. So thank God I'm not the last of the Mohicans. So Ed, if you could give me the next slide. I'm going to talk about 4 major segments. There's 7 all in Tampa Bay, and most often we're talking about the 4 major segments of Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough, Middle, and Lower, and primarily in this case because of the regulatory issue of a TMDL that EPA imposed on us back in 1998. So we keep focusing on those 4 major bay segments. But the problem goes back much earlier than that, the problem of water quality issues. And many of those water quality issues were addressed in the initial CCMP that was developed by the Estuary Program. And a lot of this work went into that CCMP. Ed, please. So I'm sorry, let's go back one. Just real quickly, I mean, there were a lot of tools, there are a lot of people and programs that really stepped up to address the water quality issues in Tampa Bay back in the day, and not the least of which was the NEP. And importantly, as Maya referred to, was the Nitrogen Management Consortium, which ended up being a very effective group of people that were able to do the right things so that we could address the issues in Tampa Bay. Next slide. So we needed something, and that something ended up being seagrasses. Why? Because seagrasses are important ecologically. People can see them, and they're a responsive part of the ecosystem, especially with respect to water quality issues. So there's a simple paradigm. If you put too much nitrogen in the water, you're going to grow phytoplankton. They're going to shade out the seagrass, and there go the seagrasses. Wayne DeFries talked about it earlier today about the Indian River Lagoon. We had a similar, but not nearly as severe loss of seagrasses over the years, and much of the work that we've been doing is to address those seagrass losses in particular. So that subcommittee, we identified where is all the nitrogen coming from, and basically there were 7 major sources of nitrogen that continue to go into Tampa Bay, including atmospheric deposition, the point sources, including both domestic and industrial, non-point sources or proverbial stormwater runoff. And unusual in a couple of the basins are some major springs as well as groundwater. And even more unique to Tampa Bay are those material losses. If you're well aware, there's mining going on in this watershed, and that fertilizer that's developed and produced in the watershed leaves this area via boats. And many of those boats had problems being leaky, and those material losses were one of the important issues, especially back early in the early 1990s. Ed, thank you. So what are the things that affect loadings, to an estuary? Obviously, rainfall has a lot to do with it, not only with respect to runoff, but also with respect to atmospheric deposition, and also with respect to issues associated with things like I&I that we were talking about earlier this week about issues with the wastewater. The other major factor driving loadings in the system is land use. So, and obviously land use has changed significantly over the years. Next one, Ed. So I'm going to take a quick trip with you along the stories of 4 bay segments. And And I don't know why I started with the worst one, but unfortunately, it's Old Tampa Bay. And that's the one that's up in that upper left-hand corner. No major freshwater inputs except for like Lake Tarpon. But for whatever reason, we just haven't been able to get our arms around Old Tampa Bay. And we're going to continue to address that. But with all the issues and all the things that people have done, basically the load has pretty much stayed the same over the years since 1985. By the way, this period of record for nitrogen loading to an estuary is maybe the longest of any of the estuaries that I know of in the United States in particular. Next slide, please. Hillsborough Bay is well known for the fact that it receives two of the major rivers, the Hillsborough River and the Alafia River, and also is well known for the Howard F. Curran wastewater plant, which every day puts in 50 to 60 million gallons a day of wastewater. So and not too surprisingly, it's those loads from those rivers and that plant in particular that had significant impacts on loadings that went into Tampa Bay. And with the various regulations, some of the things were done very cooperatively. Those load reductions have been significant over the years in Hillsborough Bay, and that's a good story. The next slide, please. Middle Tampa Bay, much the same, and you can see that in the early 2000s and the years prior to that, there were some very significant loads going into Middle Tampa Bay. And, we're in the middle of Middle Tampa Bay watershed right now, for example. But, since the mid 2000s, the loadings in Middle Tampa Bay have been significantly reduced. And even more so next, Ed, is Lower Tampa Bay. And that's incredible. Now recognize, when you do take a look at this, by the way, there's about 5 or 6 reports that we put together that report on all these loads. We have a new one coming up, which is going to take us all the way through 2020. So when that becomes available, you can get that from Ed's shop. So one of the things I just want to point out quickly is that these Y scales are not all the same. But irrespective of that, you can see that it's been a pretty good story in Lower Tampa Bay in terms of loadings going there. Next slide, please. So why are these load changes happening? Well, one of the things has to do with land use change. So this is looking at about every 5 years, land uses, especially with respect to those that are developed and those that are agriculture. Two things are obvious. The first one is that agriculture has been going down, and obviously what's happening with those ag lands, they're getting developed. So those are two of the major land uses that have significant impacts on how much loading goes into the bay. The next one, please. And specifically, if we take a look at the point sources and the non-point sources and atmospheric deposition, things have changed pretty significantly. This first bar is 1976. Those were the bad old days. We came up with some estimates. This is prior to especially the passage of the Grizzle Pig. Grizzle Pig removed all the direct discharges into Tampa Bay. So that obviously we went from a very significant contribution from point sources in the mid 1970s to something that's well less in the most recent years. Where those loads where do they now come from? Many of them are coming from stormwater from non-point sources. So those are the kind of things that have changed and are responsible for the changes over time in the loading estimates. The next slide, please. And just very quickly, all these segments, they're not all the same, mostly because of the land use changes. So here's Old Tampa Bay, of course, the stormwater loading, the non-point source is very significant. Hillsborough Bay, again, we got rid of those big point sources that were going in. That orange bar has got smaller and smaller, again, being replaced by stormwater in particular. Next slide, please. And Middle Tampa Bay, very much the same. Obviously, we've taken, there's been a big reduction in point sources. Next one is Lower Tampa Bay, and very similarly here, because of, the relative size of the watershed that goes into Lower Tampa Bay, the direct deposition of nitrogen by a dry and wet deposition is a major source of nitrogen to that bay site. Next one. So what's happened? As a result of that, and we talked about the loading, it didn't change very much in Old Tampa Bay, but guess what? The chlorophyll didn't change very much either. But the next ones, if we take a look at Hillsborough Bay, a significant reduction in chlorophyll over those years of load reductions. Next slide. Middle Tampa Bay, the same. Hillsborough Bay, or Lower Tampa Bay, I'm sorry. Again, a significant reduction in chlorophyll as a result of those load reductions. So this is what we've been talking about. We talked a lot about how seagrasses respond positively, but at the end of the day, it ends up being how much nitrogen is being delivered to the system that has the manifestation in terms of loadings, chlorophyll, and seagrasses in particular. The next slide, please. So looking to the future, one thing we can guarantee you is that that line is going to continue to go up. And that's that population that in Tampa Bay in particular. With those people coming in, we're going to have land use change. And on top of that, we're going to have climatic changes that I talked about earlier today. These are the kind of things that we have to be looking forward to and understanding if we're going to be able to effectively manage Tampa Bay into the future. So there'll be questions about, are there others? Is there enhanced monitoring? Is there enhanced management? In other words, do we need better management practices? Somebody asked a question earlier this morning about, is anybody doing anything about wastewater? Senate Bill 64 was passed by the legislature last year. All the point sources in Florida over the next 3 years have to come up with a plan for eliminating surface water discharges. So things are happening, but we need to keep an eye on things because it's just going to get worse in some cases. Thank you.
Tony, I believe we have time for some questions. Any?
Annoying person with a comment and not a question, but one of the things that I'm trying to think about today is, stretching our brains a little bit to think about how our work can effectively, how we can still accomplish the work that's like core to what we do, but also broaden it out to address these things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think the atmospheric deposition piece is a really important way that we can start to think about how clean air equates to clean water and how significant that nutrient load can be. And what that also means for people and human health, and particularly populations that are especially vulnerable to poor air quality. So I just want to put that seed out there. And I guess maybe if I did have a question associated to it is, how can we advance the state of the research on atmospheric deposition to manage that part of the load? Not necessarily from point sources, but from all the things.
Right, yeah, I mean, people always talk about stormwater runoff, they always talk about point sources, but atmospheric deposition, Tampa Bay was actually one of the first 2 estuaries in the United States that we recognized the importance of atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. It was something that was completely being lost. Some work got done in North Carolina, some work that we actually did. I did some work up in Chesapeake Bay as well. So yeah, no, it's really there. It's unfortunate because what's happened is, back in the old, we used to talk about acid rain. Well, acid rain is acid rain because of nitric acid, not only sulfuric acid. So we're not talking about that anymore, and we're not talking about the nutrients in deposition anymore either. And it's something we really need to address. Obviously it's a very significant source. So you could apply all the stormwater management you want to put in, in Lower Tampa Bay. Guess what? You've got to do something about that deposition.
Tony, just a real quick question. It showed in the Middle Tampa Bay that there was an increase in point sources over time. I was trying to figure out what that would be.
See, that's a good question. That's one of my guys, right? They know all those answers. Yeah, but I'm really not sure exactly where that point source came from. But yeah, there has been some. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, our final presenter this afternoon is joining us virtually. Kristin Jenkins, also of Janicki Environmental, will be providing us with her presentation, Applicability of Fluorescent Transect Data in the Assessment of the Flow-Plankton Relationships in the Lower Alafia River. Kristin, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thank you.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to be presenting a summary, kind of high-level overview of a series of special studies that have been conducted by Janicki Environmental along with ESA for and alongside with Tampa Bay Water regarding phytoplankton flow relationships in the lower Alafia River. Just to acknowledge my colleagues here who have all worked on this. Several of them are probably sitting in the audience there. Next, please. Just as a general map for the talk, I'll be providing an overview on the river itself and the monitoring plan real briefly, from which the data came that we used for these studies. I'll discuss some background on some ecological linkages of importance for these projects that have prompted this work, describe some previous work to develop a chlorophyll index to link flow and biological productivity, review spatially intensive fluorescence studies that were attempted to improve the understanding of these linkages, and then I'll touch briefly on a couple other studies that we are in the midst of to, again, further understand these linkages. Next, please. As mentioned, the Alafia River flows into Tampa Bay. It serves multiple water uses, including surface water withdrawals and wastewater discharges. It is a highly productive system. It has some of the highest phytoplankton concentrations of Southwest Florida tidal rivers. And those of us on this talk and many others have spent much effort into understanding the relationships between freshwater flows and the primary indicators in the Alafia River, one of which is chlorophyll as a proxy for phytoplankton biomass. And these special studies have been completed as part of Tampa Bay Water's HPMP, Hydrobiological Monitoring Program, that's associated with their water use permit. Next. So the HPMP has several elements of routine monitoring. The study Transect is about 18 kilometers with 7 different strata with both fixed and randomized station sampling that occurs. There are continuous recorders, grab samples that include the laboratory analysis of chlorophyll, as well as vertical water column profiles. In addition, and outside of the required monitoring for this program, several along the years, supplemental special studies have been conducted. And the purpose of these is to test alternative sampling and assessment methods so we can further improve our scientific understanding of the underlying conceptual model linkages to the HPMP. And I'm going to focus primarily on this first bullet here, the spatially continuous chlorophyll transect study that was done to address linkages between flows, residence time, and biological productivity. And I'll also touch a little bit on a phytoplankton community analysis looking at spatial and temporal changes that we're working on wrapping up. Next, please. So early on in the HPMP, Dr. Ernst Peebles presented this conceptual illustration, thank you, of how nutrient loads and freshwater inputs combine with the specific geomorphology of the system to create areas where trophic linkages are supported. Namely that there's spatial correlation that exists between areas of high primary production and areas of high zooplankton and benthic macroinvertebrate abundance. So this sort of kicked off a whole lot of studies, several efforts to understand spatial, temporal, and flow relationships of primary production as estimated by chlorophyll biomass in the lower Alafia River. As I mentioned, chlorophyll is one of the primary indicators of the HPMP. Next. So the initial efforts were limited to using linear regression models to predict the location of the maximum chlorophyll value in the river. And we also have and still use simple logistic regression models that are used to predict the probability of exceeding of a chlorophyll threshold with changes in freshwater flow. Mike Wessel and Tony Janicki at Basis 5, so that was in 2009, presented a study that for a model that expanded on these early efforts by developing an empirical spline model that uses graph sample data from the routine monitoring, and it's capable of estimating the biomass at any point in the lower river. And the model provides the ability to integrate predictions over various time scales to derive an index of chlorophyll biomass, describing the spatial temporal variability in the distribution and biomass of phytoplankton as a function of flow. So on the next slide, you'll see, if it's going to be animated, you'll just click through the months, kind of look at the predicted distributions over time. And you can see that during the lower flow months, low flow season, the peak chlorophyll values are located more upstream, and there's an increased likelihood for higher chlorophyll values, often over 50 micrograms per liter. But as you approach the wet season and further into the wet season, this distribution flattens out, and the magnitude of the peak shrinks, and you get sort of a washout down towards closer to the mouth of the river due to the higher flows. So while these features have been described previously, the spline model approach allowed for the dynamics of location and magnitude to be predicted for the entire lower river using a single predictive tool. And you can go on to the next slide. So with the advancement of in situ, fluorescence equipment, and flow-through technologies, we wondered if a more intense sampling methodology, both intense in sample count and spatial distribution along the sampling transect, would allow for the potential of more precise determination of the relative intensity and location of the chlorophyll maxima patterns under different flow regimes. So in other words, could a longitudinal transect fluorescence monitoring program improve upon the graph sample-based models that we just described to detail the spatial temporal patterns of chlorophyll and or improve the understanding of these ecological linkages. So we pursued two studies that I'm going to very briefly go over here because this runs long. They're listed there at the bottom of the screen. Next slide. In the first, we used chlorophyll as predicted from the fluorescence data to produce a chlorophyll index and compared that. The fluorescence index is shown here. They got cut off. I believe it's in blue. And the graph sample initial model predictions are in the red line. And as you can see, sometimes they compared very well where the peak location and the relative magnitude matched up pretty well in the upper left. On the upper right, there were times where the relative magnitude of the peaks were in agreement, but they were offset spatially in the river. Or in the bottom left, the opposite, where they were spatially equivalent, but differed in magnitude. And in some cases there on the bottom right, there was no match at all. Next, please. So the overall result from the study was that the distribution of locations of the maximum chlorophyll predicted by the graph sample models, those are the first two box plots there, more closely match the observed condition, which is the middle box, better than the transect models. Next. So while we ran into some issues with using chlorophyll concentrations predicted from the fluorescence data to adequately model chlorophyll distributions, we thought there still might be merit in the raw fluorescence data. There were many parameters that were sampled as part of that, but phycoerythrin had the most highly correlated, was the most highly correlated with laboratory chlorophyll concentrations. So Mike used the phycoerythrin to develop an index in a similar manner that's shown in the right graph there and compared it to the graph sample-based chlorophyll index. And as you can see, the patterns are quite different. In particular, the phycoerythrin index does not predict that wet season washout down the river that the graph sample model does. Next. So in summary, for the fluorescence studies, several issues were encountered with the in situ transect attempts. The fluorescence transect data included several highly correlated parameters. The chlorophyll estimated from the fluorometric data didn't really reproduce the known spatial temporal distributions. The model using chlorophyll predicted from the fluorescence data did not always perform as the accepted graph sample model. The phycoerythrin model, which was raw fluorescence data, generated different estimates of the spatiotemporal patterns for its respective endpoint than that of the graph sample-based chlorophyll index. Next. So we moved on to a couple more special studies that were not based on the fluorometric transect data, and I'll go into describe briefly two of those here. Go to the next slide. The first of which was a power analysis. We had always kind of assumed that the number of grab samples that would be required to replicate the level of information provided by the spatial transect study would be just prohibitively expensive and or would require so much time that it just is not something that could be done to replicate with traditional grab sampling and associated laboratory analyses. So a power analysis using Monte Carlo simulation was performed to determine the number of grab samples that would be required. In order to make this a reasonable examination, we wanted to consider what could actually be done in a day. We limited the scenarios to no more than a 30 sample run. Next. So it takes a while to explain these graphics. I'm going to kind of just generalize here. Among other things, we looked at the difference between the true and the simulated estimates of the area under the curve for 5 different dates and over multiple sampling scenarios, numbers per stratum, whether they were separated into river kilometers, et cetera, as well as the distribution of differences in the predicted location of peak chlorophyll values. And the results suggested that a reasonable amount of grab sampling effort could be conducted to achieve the estimated curves observed in this fluorescence special study with a certain degree of precision. Next. Okay, so all of those studies address distributions of chlorophyll, which we use as a primary indicator as a proxy for phytoplankton biomass, algal biomass. But what about potential changes due to changes in flow in the phytoplankton communities themselves? So we're in the process of wrapping up a special study using Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County, EPCHC data from 5 stations, those in the blue circle on the map there, in the lower Alafia River, to complete a series of analyses that are listed here regarding phytoplankton community structure, abundances of functional groups, specific taxa, including harmful algal bloom taxa, and relating all of these various metrics listed here to freshwater inflow. Next, please. So just to give a brief overview of some of the results that we've seen. In general, there's been a shift to greater richness and diversity later in the time series. Some further exploration is probably required to determine if that's natural or if it's an effect of changes in identification processes or taxa identification, et cetera. Many taxa, even though they may have occurred at times with great abundance or have contributed to high chlorophyll events, did not occur with enough regularity to assess spatial or temporal patterns. There were harmful algal bloom taxa that were frequently encountered. However, many of these would be considered nuisance taxa and were less frequently of the toxin-producing variety. Overall, it was difficult to develop relationships between metrics of community structure, individual phytoplankton taxa, any of the functional groups that we looked at with flow. However, there were stronger significant relationships between chlorophyll concentration and phytoplankton counts, which would be expected if you want to use it as a proxy. And this continues to support the use of chlorophyll A as a key HBMP indicator. Next. So where are we headed now? We're completing the phytoplankton community analyses, working on the final write-up for that. For the purposes of describing spatio-temporal patterns in chlorophyll, we've determined, this is my last slide. We've determined the routine graph sampling and the associated empirical models are sufficient. They align with observed patterns. If it's desired to recreate the distributions provided by the fluorescence special study, a spatially intensive graph sampling effort could be done. But outside of these tidal process related questions, algal blooms pose other issues outside of this. Algal blooms could affect future water quality in the regional supply sources. So additional routine monitoring of phytoplankton is being evaluated. And these evaluations will include considerations of monitoring objectives, locations, whether to target certain species, and the development of relationships with continuous water quality sensors currently being implemented. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Kristin.
We do have time for a couple of questions and then we'll take a break.
Does anyone have any questions for Kristin?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, good stuff. Full disclosure, I did my PhD in optical oceanography, so I'll try to not geek out too much. But I actually had two questions. Number one, from what I know about the Alafia River, it tends to be rather CDOM rich. There's a lot of color, especially at certain times of the year. So I'm just curious what your thoughts were on the CDOM signal kind of interfering with your fluorescence signature. The other question I had was dealing with like some of the curves that you showed for your Transect monitoring was really smooth. So a lot of the experience I've had using chlorophyll fluorescence, get a lot of noise in the data. And then, you know, if you're doing continuous measurements, you end up with like 10,000 rows of data. How did you handle that? Like, did you use a smoothing function or something like that in order to get those smooth curves, or was the data smooth like that? Thank you.
In regards to the first, yes, there were, it is a highly colored system. And there were issues. There was a whole part of the presentation that I left out with how did we calculate the chlorophyll values based on the different fluorescence. And there was a whole study on what regressions we use, multiple step regressions, et cetera. And yes, in all likelihood, there was interference. So it's one of the reasons we kind of keep falling back on let's stick with these grab samples looking specifically at chlorophyll. In regards to your second, I may have to boot it to Mike Wessel, but it's my understanding that there were smoothing functions that were used as part of it was all done in SAS. So those model predictions, I believe, had a smoothing factor in them. If you were just to plot, you know, we took like 10 to 15 chlorophyll samples to go along with, you know, a 17-kilometer transect of fluorescence data. So there is some temporal and spatial smoothing that goes on.
Kristin, thank you very much. I think that's going to be all the time that we have here this afternoon. Thank you very much to all of our presenters and to all the feedback from the audience.